5 tin plates, 3 potato peels, one mother's hands trembling, but precise. Maggie Dawson knelt on the frozen floor dividing scraps among her 5 starving children. She smiled like she was serving a feast. Outside, through a crack in the wall, a man on horseback watched. What he saw that night would change everything. But he didn't know she was watching him back. This is the story of how a basket of eggs became a scandal, how kindness became love, and how 2 broken people found each other in the Montana winter of 1878. 5 tin plates, 3 potato peels, one mother's hands trembling but precise. Maggie Dawson knelt on the frozen floor of the shack near the lumberyard. The lamplight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the faces of 5 children gathered around a table made from stacked crates. Before them lay the evening meal. Potato peelings, a heel of bread, hard as river stones, bacon grease scraped so thin from the pan it barely glistened. She divided these scraps with hands that shook from hunger, but moved with absolute precision. 5 small piles, 5 hungry mouths. There now, a fine Christmas supper for my fine children. Rose, 10 years old, touched her mother's sleeve. Mama, you ain't eating again. I had plenty earlier, sweet girl. Maggie smoothed her daughter's hair back gentle and steady. This is all for you. The youngest child, Samuel, barely 3 years old, clutched a potato peel in both small fists and grinned up at his mother like she'd handed him gold. Mama, this is the best supper ever. Maggie laughed. The sound was warm and real and unbroken. The laugh of a woman who refused to let her children know they were starving. Outside, through a gap in the wall, a man sat on his horse in the falling snow, watching. His name was Ethan Pierce, and what he saw that night would change everything for both of them. The iron-gray mare stamped and snorted beneath him, breath clouding white against the December dark. His saddlebags hung heavy with supplies from Brennan's store. Flour, salt, coffee, enough provisions for a month on the ranch. He had no reason to stop here. No reason to look through the warped slats of this leaning shack that stood crooked against the Montana wind. But the lamplight had caught his eye, a flicker through the cracks, movement inside. Ethan pulled the mare to a halt and looked through the gap between planks. He saw a woman kneeling on bare floorboards, 5 children around a makeshift table. She wore a dress so faded the color had given up. Sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold that seeped through every crack in those thin walls. And she was smiling. Not the desperate smile of someone pretending, not the brittle mask of a woman trying to hold herself together. This was genuine warmth pouring from her like July sunshine through those frozen walls, as if she were serving a feast instead of dividing garbage among her children. The sight hit Ethan like a fist to the chest. He knew hunger, knew it personal, knew its face and its smell, and the sound it made in a boy's belly at night when his mama thought he was sleeping. He'd built himself past it acre by acre, year by year. 300 acres of prime grazing land, barns full of cattle, a house with more rooms than one man could ever fill. He'd forgotten what hunger looked like on a mother's face until now. The memory rose unbidden, sharp as broken glass. Winter of 1853. He was 10 years old. His mother, Martha Pierce, sitting at their own crooked table in a shack not much better than this one, dividing one hard biscuit into 2 pieces, the larger for him, the smaller for herself. Her hands red and cracked from washing other people's laundry. The way she'd sung while she worked, voice bright, like nothing was wrong, even when there wasn't a crumb left in the house. And then one morning, a 50-pound sack of flour had appeared on their porch. No note, no name. Just flour that kept them alive until spring work came, and Martha Pierce found steady employment. He never learned who left it, but he learned what it meant, that sometimes mercy came from strangers, that goodness didn't need a name attached, that one person's quiet act could pull a family back from the edge of ruin. Ethan had been standing over his mother's grave 5 years ago, 20 years after that terrible winter when he'd found the letter tucked in her Bible, written in her careful hand but never sent. To whoever left the flour, you saved my son's life. I will never forget your kindness. The letter had changed him, made him swear a silent oath while snow fell on her fresh-turned grave. If he ever had the means, he'd be that person for somebody else. Well, he had the means now, more than enough. But as he sat on his horse watching Maggie Dawson smile at her starving children, Ethan realized this wasn't about paying a debt anymore. This was about something deeper. something that scared him more than any blizzard ever had. He backed his horse away, slow, careful. The snow muffled the hooves, but his heart hammered loud enough to wake the dead. He rode toward the ranch as the last light bled from the sky, the vast emptiness of his land stretching around him like a question he couldn't answer. What Ethan didn't know was that Maggie had opened her eyes. She hadn't been sleeping. Couldn't sleep when her children went to bed hungry. She lay on the thin mattress they all shared, listening to their breathing, counting the hours until dawn, when she'd have to tell them again that breakfast would be light, that they had to make do, that everything would be fine. Through the crack in the shutters, she'd seen the shadow of a man on horseback. Tall, broad shoulders, a long coat, the gray horse visible even in the darkness. Too dark to see his face, but she saw the way he moved. Careful, almost tender as he set something on her doorstep. Then he rode away, and Maggie pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out loud and waking the children. Who was he? Why would anyone help a mail-order bride widow with 5 children and nothing to offer in return? The questions burned in her mind as she waited for dawn. The sky was just beginning to turn gray when Maggie finally rose and went to the door, her bare feet silent on the frozen boards, her heart beating so hard she thought it might wake the house. She opened the door. Golden morning light spilled across the threshold, and there on the step sat a wicker basket covered with clean cloth. Maggie knelt down, pulled back the fabric with trembling fingers, eggs packed carefully in straw, a 10-pound sack of flour, bacon wrapped in butcher paper, 6 good potatoes without eyes or soft spots, 2 cans of milk, dried apples, a small sack of sugar. Oh, God. The words came out as a whisper. Oh, thank you. Thank you. She pressed the basket to her chest like it was a living thing, like it was the most precious cargo she'd ever held. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away because her hands were full of this impossible gift, this answer to prayers she'd been too proud to pray out loud. Rose appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Mama, are you crying? Happy tears, sweet girl. Maggie's voice broke on the words. Only happy tears. Come see what the angel brought us. Within minutes, all 5 children clustered around the basket. Jack's eyes went wide as moons. Lucy gasped. Hannah bounced on her toes. Sam reached out with both hands like he wanted to touch everything at once. Did the angel really come? Mama Jack's voice held wonder and disbelief in equal measure. Yes, baby, the angel came. But even as Maggie said it, she knew the truth. This wasn't an angel. This was a man, a real man who'd sat on his horse in the snow and watched through the wall. A man who'd seen her shame and her hunger and her desperate smile. And instead of judgment, he'd brought mercy. The question was why, and the question was who. And the question that scared her most was what would happen when she found out. 24 hours earlier, Maggie had walked out of the mayor's office with a piece of paper clutched in her hand and hope dying in her chest. Application for town assistance denied. Reason given resources allocated to families with stronger community ties. Which was a polite way of saying that mail-order brides who showed up with another man's children weren't considered real members of Bitter Creek, Montana territory. Behind her, Rose carried Sam on her hip. Lucy held Hannah's hand. Jack walked beside his mother with his shoulders back and his chin up the way his father had taught him before the mine took Thomas Dawson's life. They made their way down Main Street through December cold that bit through their threadbare coats. People watched from windows and doorways. Some faces showed pity. Others showed judgment. None showed help. At Hawkins' general store, Mrs. Hawkins stood behind the counter with her mouth pursed like she'd been sucking lemons. Mrs. Dawson, I'm sorry, but I can't extend more credit. You already owe $12. Maggie kept her back straight and her voice steady. I'll pay it back. I'm washing clothes for Mrs. Henderson next week. Mrs. Hawkins looked at the 5 children clustered around Maggie's skirts. Her expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy if it wasn't so laced with condescension. Washing clothes won't feed 5 mouths, dear. Have you thought about, well, perhaps the church orphanage could take some of them temporarily until you get on your feet? The words landed like a slap. Maggie's voice went cold as the December wind. My children stay with me, always. She turned and walked out with her head high and her children following like ducklings in a line. Rose squeezed her mother's hand. Jack glared back at Mrs. Hawkins with protective fury in his young eyes. They passed the bakery. Maggie stopped at the window looking at the bread and pies displayed behind the glass. Her hand went into her pocket. She counted the coins by feel. 3 pennies. Not enough for a loaf, not nearly enough. Sam tugged at her skirt. Mama, I'm hungry. Maggie knelt down until she was eye level with her youngest son. I know, baby. She cupped his face in her work-roughened hands. Tonight we'll have a feast, I promise. It was a lie, but it was a lie born of love, and Maggie would tell 1,000 such lies if it meant her children could sleep without fear gnawing at their bellies. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching that moment. Someone who would remember the way she knelt in the snow to comfort her son. Someone who would see the dignity in her spine, even as hunger tried to break it. That evening, as Maggie divided potato peels and told her children it was Christmas supper, Ethan Pierce sat in his dining room, staring at a plate of food he couldn't eat. Agnes Porter, his housekeeper for the past 5 years, had outdone herself. Roasted chicken with crispy skin, potatoes golden with butter, fresh bread still warm from the oven, preserved peaches glistening in a china bowl. Steam rose from the plates in fragrant clouds. Ethan looked at it all and felt sick. Mr. Pierce having trouble with your appetite tonight. Agnes stood in the doorway with her arms folded, concern etching lines across her weathered face. I ain't hungry. You rode through town for 3 hours and you ain't hungry. She didn't believe him, but 5 years of keeping his house had taught her when silence served better than questions. But tonight she lingered. Something wrong, Mr. Pierce? Tell me something, Agnes. Ethan pushed the plate away. You ever watch somebody go hungry while you sat at a full table? Her eyes narrowed. Can't say I have. I did tonight. He stood chair scraping against the floor. And I can't get the taste of this chicken out of my mouth because of it. He left the dining room without explaining further. Left Agnes to clear the untouched meal and wonder what had gotten into the man she'd worked for all these years. Ethan climbed the stairs to his study and stood at the window watching snow fall across his prosperous land. The memories came whether he wanted them or not. His mother's hands cracked and bleeding from lye soap and cold water. The way she'd sing hymns while hanging other people's clean laundry, her voice carrying across frozen yards, like she had something to be joyful about. The winter they'd had nothing, absolutely nothing. And he'd watched her face when she thought he wasn't looking, seen the quiet desperation she hid behind smiles and songs. Then that morning, the flower on the porch, his mother on her knees weeping with relief and gratitude for a stranger's kindness. 20 years later, standing over her grave, Ethan had read her unsent letter and made his vow. If I ever have the means, I'll be that person for somebody else. He had the means now. More land than he could ride in a day, more cattle than he could count. A house full of empty rooms that echoed when he walked through them. 3 years since Sarah died. 3 years of living like a ghost in his own home, going through the motions of ranching and eating and sleeping without really being alive. Maybe it was time to keep his promise. Maybe it was time to matter to someone. Ethan stopped pacing. Through the window, stars burned cold and distant against the black sky. The snow kept falling soft and relentless, covering everything in white silence. He made his decision. At 4 in the morning, Ethan moved through his kitchen with purpose hardening like frost in his bones. He filled the largest wicker basket he owned with careful deliberation. Eggs packed in straw so none would crack. A 10-pound sack of flour. Bacon wrapped in butcher paper, thick slices from Brennan's best stock. 6 good potatoes, 2 cans of milk, dried apples. A small sack of sugar that cost more than it should, but would let those children taste sweetness they'd probably forgotten existed. He wrapped everything in clean cloth, tied it with twine, left no note. Agnes appeared in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in her dressing gown, hair in a long gray braid. Where you headed this early? Mr. Piercetown, in the dark, before dawn. Some things can't wait for daylight. Agnes looked at the basket, then at Ethan's face, and understanding dawned in her eyes. That basket looks heavy. Mind you don't strain yourself. Ethan met her gaze and saw nothing but quiet approval there. Lightest thing I've carried in years, Agnes. The sky was still black when he saddled the mare and secured the basket behind the saddle. Stars faded at the edges as he rode toward town, his breath clouding thick in the brutal cold. No one stirred on the streets. Shops stood dark. Snow lay undisturbed on every porch and walkway. Ethan guided his horse through the back alley behind the lumberyard, approaching the shack from the side where no windows faced. No smoke rose from the chimney. The family would be sleeping still, conserving firewood, stretching every stack of wood the same way they stretched every scrap of food. He dismounted quiet. His boots crunched on frozen ground. The basket felt lighter than it should, though it held more food than he'd eat in 3 days. He set it on the doorstep and adjusted the cloth so the wind wouldn't pull it loose. His hands shook, though, whether from cold or something deeper he couldn't name. For a moment he stood there, imagining her opening the door at first light, finding abundance where there had been nothing. The shock on her face. Maybe tears. The children gathering close their wonder at eggs and flour and sugar. The relief of a mother who could feed her children something real today. Ethan retreated before the sky lightened. Back at the ranch, he stood in the barn as dawn broke gold and pink across the snow-covered land. The empty stalls, the silent house, the white fields stretching away in every direction. He'd built an empire and filled it with cattle and timber and profit. But nothing that mattered. Nothing that breathed or laughed or called his name. This ain't a one-time thing. He said it aloud to no one, to himself, to the ghost of his mother, maybe to Gun. I'm going to keep bringing them until she don't need me to, until those kids grow strong, until she can divide plenty instead of scraps. The words settled into his bones like purpose. He walked toward the house as the sun climbed higher, warming the frozen world. For the first time in years, maybe since he'd finished building this ranch, the work ahead of him felt like it mattered. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that gave Ethan's mornings a shape they'd never had. He woke before dawn every day and filled the basket while coffee brewed. He rode different routes so nobody would track the pattern. North one morning, east the next, once through the creek bed where cottonwood trees screened the path. He left the basket before light broke, before Maggie woke, before the town stirred. The basket always came back empty. She left it on her doorstep each evening, scrubbed clean, the cloth pressed flat with creases sharp enough to cut. Then one morning in the second week, a wildflower appeared tucked in the handle, purple petals bright against brown wicker. It was barely the edge of spring, and flowers had no business blooming yet. She'd searched the creek banks in the snow and cold, found something growing against all odds, and left it as thanks she couldn't speak. Ethan pressed the flower between pages of his Bible, a fragile gift from a woman whose name he'd never said aloud to her face. He varied what he brought. Essentials always. Eggs, flour, bacon, milk. But other things too. A jar of honey golden as sunlight. A tin of tea. And one night when sleep wouldn't come, he sat at his workbench and carved a small wooden horse for the boy. He'd seen Sam at church, barely 3 years old, with eyes that followed every movement and a smile that could break your heart. Ethan sanded the horse smooth until the grain shone, then tucked it among the potatoes in the next morning's basket. For Rose, the oldest girl who tried to read the Reverend's Bible from 3 pews back, he wrapped a primer in oilcloth. The next week, he added a reader with simple stories. Then a book of poems, because every child deserved beauty alongside survival. For Lucy, the quiet one who drew pictures on scraps of paper with charcoal stubs, he included a set of real drawing pencils. Nothing fancy, but better than what she had. For little Hannah, 4 years old with curls that bounced when she walked, he tucked in a small rag doll. Agnes had helped him sew it, and he'd never tell a living soul he'd sat at the kitchen table stitching a doll's dress while his housekeeper tried not to smile. And for Jack, he carved a second wooden horse, larger and stronger, just right for a 7-year-old boy who dreamed of riding. The drawings started coming back with the baskets, crude sketches on scraps of paper. A house with smoke curling from the chimney, flowers and colors that didn't exist in nature. A family of stick figures holding hands. 7 of them, now not 6. The extra figure stood apart, taller than the rest, with something square in its hands. A basket. Ethan kept every drawing in his desk drawer, smoothing them flat, studying them like they were treasure maps to a country he'd never visited but desperately wanted to see. Sunday mornings he saw them at church. Maggie sat in the back pew with 5 children, scrubbed and neat despite threadbare clothes. She held her head high, sang hymns in a voice clear as creek water, accepted no pity from anyone. When their eyes met across the congregation, something passed between them. She didn't know it was him, but he could see her lips moving during silent prayer, hand pressed to her heart, praying for the stranger who'd kept her family alive. Ethan gripped the pew in front of him until his knuckles went white. You've been cheerful lately, Mr. Pierce. Agnes set breakfast down one Thursday, watching him with eyes that missed nothing. Whistling while you work? Haven't heard that since I don't know when. Spring coming? Ethan kept his attention on his plate. Spring don't usually make a man whistle at 4 in the morning while packing a basket. She arched one eyebrow. But I suppose that's none of my business. Ethan looked at her. She looked right back. Neither blinked. No, ma'am, I reckon it ain't. Agnes smiled just barely and cleared the dishes without another word. One morning in the third week, Ethan found a note tucked in the return basket. The paper was rough, torn from an old book. The pencil letters were careful and unsteady. Some words were misspelled. It didn't matter. To my unknown friend, you have saved us. There are no words sufficient for such kindness. May God bless your generous heart and return to you tenfold what you have given. Your grateful recipient. Ethan stood in his barn with early light slanting through gaps in the boards and read the note 4 times. His throat went tight. His eyes burned. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket where it rested against his heart. That evening he carved another toy, a small wooden bird, sanded it until the grain caught the lamplight. The baskets had started as duty as debt owed to a nameless stranger who'd once saved a boy and his mother with a sack of flour. But somewhere between the first delivery and this woman's misspelled note, the feeling had shifted into something Ethan Pierce didn't have a name for yet. Something warmer than charity. Something that scared him more than any blizzard ever had. And Ethan, who'd faced down cattle thieves and drought and winters that killed half his herd, didn't know what to do with fear like this. So he did the only thing he understood. He kept bringing the baskets. The fourth week came in hard with a late-season storm that rolled down from the mountains and buried Bitter Creek under 2 feet of fresh snow. Temperature dropped so low the mercury in Peterson's porch thermometer froze solid. Cattle huddled against barn walls. Pipes burst. The creek stopped moving, entirely locked under ice thick enough to drive a wagon across. Ethan rode through it anyway. Dutch found him in the barn at 3 in the morning, saddling the mare by lantern light. "Boss, you ain't serious. Can't see 10 feet in this mess. I've ridden worse." When in what life? Dutch pulled his coat tighter against the cold that seeped even into the barn. "Whatever you're doing out there before dawn, every morning it can wait one day." "No." Ethan cinched the saddle tight. "It can't." Dutch stared at him a long moment. Snow howled against the barn walls, rattling the boards like bones. "You're going to get yourself killed. Then I'll die doing something that matters." Ethan swung up into the saddle. "Go back to bed, Dutch, stubborn fool." Dutch muttered it as Ethan rode into the white darkness, but he said it with something close to respect. The ride took twice as long in the storm. Ethan hunched low against the mare's neck, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own frozen eyes. Wind cut through his coat like it wasn't there. Snow drove sideways, stinging his face raw. He found the shack by memory more than sight. Set the basket on the doorstep with hands so numb he could barely feel the handle. This time he'd packed extra, more firewood bundled and tied to the saddle, a thick wool blanket he'd pulled from his own bed, jerky and hardtack that would keep without cooking in case her stove went cold. He was untying the firewood when the door opened. Ethan froze flat against the wall, not breathing. Maggie stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thin shawl, barefoot on the frozen boards. She held a candle that guttered in the wind. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, dark auburn, catching the flame's light. She looked left, right, squinting into the storm. "Hello?" Her voice came small against the howling wind. "Is someone there?" Ethan pressed himself flat against the wall. The breath left his lungs, but he made no sound. Maggie stood there a long moment. Snow collected on her bare feet, on her shoulders, and her hair. She was shivering so hard the candle flame danced wild. Then she looked down and saw the basket, saw the firewood. Her free hand flew to her mouth. She knelt right there on the frozen porch in the snow in her nightgown and pulled back the cloth covering the basket. Even in the dim candlelight, Ethan saw her face change, saw something break open behind her eyes. Relief and wonder and grief all tangled together in a way that made his chest crack wide. "Oh God," she whispered it like a prayer. "Oh, thank you. Thank you." She pressed the basket to her chest, and then she saw the firewood and the blanket. Maggie Dawson, who never cried where anyone could see, who held her head high in church, While the whole town whispered, who told her starving children that potato peels were a feast, put her face in her hands and sobbed. The sound went through Ethan like a blade. He wanted to step forward, wanted to say her name, wanted to wrap that blanket around her shoulders himself and carry her inside where it was warm. But he stayed pressed against the wall because this wasn't about him. This was about her, about letting her have this moment of relief without the burden of knowing who to thank, who to owe, who to feel beholden to. Maggie gathered the firewood in her arms, made 2 trips, carried the basket last, pressed the door shut behind her with her hip. Through the thin walls, Ethan heard her moving, the clank of the stove door, the crack and snap of fresh wood catching flame. Then her voice thick with tears, but trying to be steady. Rose, Rose, wake up, sweet girl. We got firewood, real firewood. And look, there's bacon and eggs and flour. A child's sleepy voice. From the angel again, Mama. Yes, baby, from the angel again. Mama, are you crying? Happy tears, sweet girl. Only happy tears. Ethan stood in the storm until his legs went numb and his fingers lost all feeling. Then he rode home through white darkness, frozen solid from hat to boots, and didn't feel the cold at all, because something inside him burned so hot nothing could touch it. He sat at his kitchen table as dawn struggled gray through the storm. Agnes found him there an hour later, still in his wet coat, staring at nothing. Lord have mercy. She took one look at him and started heating water. You look half dead. I'm fine. You ain't fine. You're frozen through and sitting in a puddle of snow, melt on my clean floor. She set a cup of hot coffee in front of him. Drink that before you catch your death. Ethan wrapped his hands around the cup. The heat stung his numb fingers back to life. Mr. Pierce. Agnes sat down across from him. In 5 years of keeping his house, she'd never once sat at his table while he was in the room. I've worked for you since you built this place. Never asked your business. Never pried. I know that, Agnes, but I'm asking now. Her voice was firm but kind. What's got hold of you? Ethan looked at her. This woman who'd watched him build his fortune and live alone inside it, who pressed his shirts and cooked his meals, and never once asked why a man with everything seemed to have nothing. You remember the Dawson widow lives in that shack by the old lumber yard? 5 children. Husband killed in the mines. I know of her. She's been feeding those kids potato peels and bread heels, dividing scraps like it's a banquet and smiling while she does it. His voice roughened. Her youngest don't even know he's starving, Agnes. He thinks his mama is giving him a feast. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. And the baskets you've been packing every morning. You knew I ain't blind, Mr. Pierce, and I ain't deaf. Hard to miss a man raiding his own pantry at 4 in the morning. She folded her hands on the table. How long? 4 weeks. She know it's you know, and I aim to keep it that way. Agnes studied him with eyes that had seen plenty of life in most of its sorrows. You're in love with her. I'm helping her. I said what I said. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Because maybe Agnes was right. Maybe this had stopped being about repaying an old debt and started being about a woman with auburn hair who smiled while dividing garbage. A woman who sang hymns with a voice that made his chest ache. A woman who wrote thank you notes with misspelled words that meant more than any eloquent letter ever could. Agnes stood pushing her chair back. For what it's worth, I think it's the finest thing you've ever done. Finer than this ranch. Finer than all your cattle and land put together. She paused at the doorway. But you can't love a woman from behind a wall forever, Mr. Pierce. Sooner or later, you got to knock on the door. She left him sitting there with those words and his cooling coffee, and Ethan knew she was right. The question was whether he had the courage to do it. Sunday came cold and bitter. Ethan dressed for church with the same care he always took, but his hands were unsteady on his collar buttons. He rode into town with his jaw set and his stomach churning. The congregation was already filling the pews when he walked in. Conversations dimmed. Eyes followed him. Not all of them, but enough. Maggie was already in the back pew with her 5 children pressed close, scrubbed and combed. Rose had the primer open on her lap. Lucy sat quiet with a drawing pencil tucked behind her ear. Jack fidgeted with the wooden horse in his pocket. Hannah whispered to Sam, who clutched his own horse and tried to sit still. Maggie's eyes met Ethan's for one brief second as he walked to his seat. Something flickered in them. Recognition of the tension in the room. The weighted glances, the whispers that followed him like a shadow. She knows something's different, Ethan thought. She can feel it too. He took his seat in the third pew and tried to focus on Reverend Hayes, but his attention kept drifting to the back of the church where Maggie sat with her head bowed during prayer lips, moving in words he couldn't hear but understood. She was praying for him, for the stranger who left baskets in the dark. When the hymn started, Maggie sang. Her voice rose above the congregation clear and true, and Ethan felt it in his bones. After service, the congregation spilled onto the church steps. Children ran between the wagons. Men talked about weather and cattle prices. Women gathered in clusters trading gossip like currency. Ethan hung back, watching Maggie help her children into their wagon. The ancient buckboard leaned to one side. The horse was a sway-backed mare that had seen better decades. Rose climbed up first, then helped Lucy. Jack scrambled over the side. Maggie lifted Hannah, then Sam, settling them in the wagon bed with a blanket tucked around their legs. Ethan took a step forward, then another. His pulse hammered in his throat. But before he could reach her, Sam jumped down from the wagon and ran straight toward him. The boy held up his wooden horse, grinning. "Mister, did you make thunder?" Ethan froze. He knelt down until he was eye level with the child. "What's that, son?" "My mama said the angel made thunder." Sam held the horse higher, turning it so Ethan could see every detail. "But angels don't use sandpaper. I can see the marks." From 10 feet away, Maggie made a small sound. Ethan looked up. Their eyes met across the space between them. And in that single second, everything unspoken passed between them. She knew. He could see it in her face, in the way her hand pressed against her heart. She'd known, and she hadn't stopped him, hadn't refused the baskets, hadn't turned him away. "Sam." Maggie's voice came quiet but firm. "Come here, please." The boy obeyed, but he looked back over his shoulder at Ethan with those round, knowing eyes. "Bye, Mr. Thundermaker." Ethan stood. His legs trembled beneath him. Maggie held his gaze for one more second. She didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Recognition mixed with something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or fear. Or hope. Then she turned away and helped Sam into the wagon. Ethan watched her drive off down the frozen road, and he knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. She knew who he was, and tomorrow he would have to decide what to do about it. The rumors started on Tuesday morning at Brennan's Mercantile. Ethan stood at the counter with his usual list. Eggs more than any bachelor could eat in a month. Flour the third sack this month. Bacon thick cut and expensive. Sugar, milk, coffee beans. Mrs. Ida Brennan stood behind the register, her eyes tracking each item like a banker tallying debts. Her mouth had that pinched look of someone who'd been chewing on gossip and found it sweet. "That's considerable provisions for a bachelor, Mr. Pierce." Ethan counted out coins without looking up. "I eat considerable, ma'am. Eggs, flour, bacon, sugar, milk." Ida's finger tapped each item as she spoke. "And this is the third time this month you've bought this exact list. A person might wonder who's eating all that food." He met her gaze, his voice flat and cold as January frost. "A person might mind her own business." Her smile went thin as wire. "Just making conversation." "Mr. Pierce." Ethan gathered his purchases and left, but he felt her eyes drilling into his back all the way down the street, felt them cataloging every detail to be shared with every willing ear in Bitter Creek. Ida Brennan had the sharpest tongue and the loosest lips in town. If she hadn't already started talking, she would before sundown. By Thursday, the whispers had spread like fire in dry grass. Ethan heard them in fragments, pieces of conversation that stopped dead when he walked past. At the feed store, 2 ranch hands went silent mid-sentence, suddenly fascinated by a pile of bridles. At the post office, Mrs. Hawkins and her sister turned away, too quick, their hushed voices carrying one word he caught clear as a bell. Dawson. On Friday morning, he rode into town for fence wire and found 3 women clustered outside the general store. They scattered when they saw him coming, but not before he heard Ida Brennan's voice carrying sharp in the cold air. Buying supplies no single man needs. Leaving his ranch before dawn every morning. You tell me what that looks like. Maybe he's got a sweetheart somewhere. Another woman's voice uncertain. Ida snorted. Sweetheart, he's leaving things for that Dawson woman. The mail-order bride. Mark my words. And we all know what a wealthy bachelor wants from a poor widow with no family to protect her. The words hit Ethan like a fist to the gut. He pulled the mare to a stop. The women saw him and went pale. Ladies, his voice came flat and cold as the frozen ground beneath them. Ida recovered first, lifting her chin. Mr. Pierce, we were just discussing the weather. Sounded like you were discussing my business, Mrs. Brennan, and getting the facts wrong while you did it. Her chin lifted higher. Facts have a way of speaking for themselves. Ethan looked at her until she dropped her eyes. Then he rode on without another word. But the damage was done. Ida Brennan's speculation would reach every ear in Bitter Creek before supper. By Sunday, it would be gospel truth in the minds of every gossip in town. That evening, Dutch confirmed what Ethan already knew. The old foreman found him in the barn checking on a mare about to foal. Dutch cleared his throat with the careful deliberation of a man handling something breakable. It's worse than I figured, boss. Tell me, half the town thinks you're courting the Dawson widow in secret. Dutch's weathered face showed genuine concern. The other half thinks something less honorable. Ethan's hand clenched on the stall gate so hard the wood groaned. Mrs. Brennan's saying you're taking advantage of a woman with no means to refuse, that you're buying her with groceries. That's a filthy lie, I know that, you know that. But folks who don't know you are going to believe what they want to believe. Dutch spat tobacco into the straw. And right now, what they want to believe ain't pretty. I haven't spoken to Maggie Dawson more than once in my life, at church, in front of 50 people. Don't matter, the story's got legs now. Dutch shifted his weight. Reverend Hayes was asking about you after service last week. Casual-like but pointed. Wanted to know if you'd been keeping company with anyone. Ethan stared at the lantern hanging from the beam, its flame wavering, throwing shadows that jumped and twisted against the walls. What do you think I should do, Dutch? Ain't my place to say. I'm asking. The old foreman was quiet a long time. I think you're the most decent man I ever worked for. And I think what you're doing for that woman and her kids is the kind of thing they preach about on Sundays, but nobody actually does. He paused. I also think this town will eat you alive if you let it. So I should stop. I didn't say that. I said you should know what's coming. Ethan nodded slow. They finished checking the horses in silence, but Dutch's warning circled in his mind like a hawk over open ground. That same Friday afternoon, Maggie walked into Hawkins' general store needing thread. She had to patch Jack's coat where the elbow had torn through letting cold in. She counted her coins 3 times before entering, making sure she had enough. Miss Hawkins stood behind the counter with another woman, their voices pitched low, but carrying clear across the small shop. That Pierce rancher's been buying enough food for a family of 6. Eggs and flour and bacon, same as what's been showing up on certain doorsteps. Well, the other woman drew the word out, dripping it with meaning heavy as poison. I suppose a widow with 5 mouths to feed can't afford to be particular about where her help comes from, or what it costs. Maggie's hands went cold. The thread she'd come for blurred in her vision. Mrs. Hawkins noticed her standing there and had the decency to look embarrassed at least. Mrs. Dawson, I didn't hear you come in. I need white thread. Maggie's voice came out steady. She was proud of that. 1 spool, of course. Mrs. Hawkins wrapped the thread, took the coins. Their fingers didn't touch during the exchange. Have a pleasant afternoon. Maggie walked out without looking back. She made it 3 blocks before her legs started shaking. She pressed her back against the wall of the feed store and breathed deep until the trembling stopped. They thought she was selling herself. That was what the whispers meant, what the glances said, what the sermon would be about come Sunday. The whole town believed she'd traded her dignity for a basket of eggs. Shame burned through her like acid, followed immediately by rage. She hadn't asked for the baskets, hadn't sought them out, hadn't done a single thing wrong except be poor and accept help from someone kind enough to offer it without conditions. And now the town wanted to make it filthy. That night, Maggie sat at the crate table after the children fell asleep and stared at the empty doorstep through the cracked window. Tomorrow morning, the basket would come. It had come every morning for 6 weeks without fail. But now the gift carried weight it hadn't before. Now accepting it meant accepting the town's judgment, their knowing smirks and whispered accusations. She thought about leaving the basket untouched, letting it sit there until whoever brought it understood she couldn't take it anymore. Then she looked at her children. Rose curled around Lucy in one bed. Jack sprawled across the other one arm, flung out the wooden horse on his pillow. Hannah and Sam slept tangled together under the wool blanket that had appeared in the basket 2 weeks ago. Their faces were fuller now. Their cheeks had color. Jack had grown half an inch. Sam wasn't crying from hunger in his sleep anymore. Maggie put her face in her hands. She couldn't refuse the baskets. Not when refusing meant watching her children shrink back to bone and hollow eyes. Not when she'd already seen the difference between enough and nothing. But she couldn't accept them either. Not with the whole town watching and counting and making her something she wasn't. The choice felt like being torn in half. Morning came gray and cold. Maggie opened the door to find the basket waiting as always. The cloth was damp with snow. She brought it inside fast before any neighbors could see and hated herself for the furtiveness, for hiding kindness like it was something shameful. Inside the basket, beneath the eggs and flour, she found a scrap of paper, 3 words in careful handwriting. "You are brave." Maggie read it 7 times, then as she sat down on the floor and cried so hard her ribs ached. Because she didn't feel brave. She felt trapped, caught between hunger and pride, between her children's needs and a town's cruelty, between gratitude for a stranger's mercy and fury that mercy could be made into something ugly. She folded the note and pressed it against her heart where it would stay hidden in the pocket of her dress. Across town, Ethan sat at his desk trying to write a letter to Reverend Hayes. 3 drafts went into the fire. The words kept coming out wrong, too angry, too defensive, too much like a man explaining himself to people who'd already made up their minds. He gave up on the letter and started packing the next basket instead. His hands moved through the routine while his mind churned. Dutch's warning. The Reverend's lecture he knew was coming. Ida Brennan's poisoned tongue. The weight of a whole town pressing down on something that had started as simple goodness and been twisted into scandal. He could stop. The thought came clear and cold, and for one terrible moment he let himself consider it. He could stop bringing baskets. Let the church board take over with their forms and procedures and the careful condescension that made charity feel like punishment. He could save his reputation, protect his standing, go back to being the respected rancher everyone admired. All he had to do was abandon a woman and 5 children to hunger. All he had to do was become the kind of man who let gossip matter more than a child's full belly. Ethan stared at the basket, at Maggie's notes still in his pocket, at the children's drawings tucked in his desk drawer. Rose's careful letters, Lucy's purple flowers, Jack's horses running wild across scraps of paper, Hannah's stick figure family with a tall man holding a basket, Sam's wobbly circles that might have been faces or sons or just a small boy's joy at having a pencil. He thought about his mother, about the flour sack on the porch, about the person who'd left it without a name, without explanation, without caring what the neighbors thought. That person hadn't stopped when it got hard, hadn't weighed reputation against righteousness, had simply done what needed doing and walked away. Ethan closed his eyes. When he opened them, his hands were already reaching for the eggs. He packed the basket with more care than usual. Added extra bacon, a jar of preserved peaches from his own cellar, a pouch of peppermint candy for the children. And at the bottom, wrapped in a clean handkerchief, a small gold locket he'd found in his mother's things. Simple and plain, worth more in meaning than money. He didn't know why he included it. Didn't let himself think too hard about what it meant giving a piece of his mother to a woman he had barely spoken to. Some things didn't need explaining. Some things just needed doing. Before dawn, he saddled the mare. This time he didn't take the back alleys, didn't cut through the creek bed or hide behind buildings. He rode straight down the main road as the sky went from black to gray. The basket sat visible behind his saddle where anyone looking out a window could see it plain. Let them see. Let them count the eggs and weigh the flour and add up whatever ugly arithmetic they wanted. He was done hiding kindness like it was a crime. The cold bit at his face as he rode. His breath clouded white. The town slept around him, but he could feel it watching, could feel the eyes behind curtained windows, the judgments forming in darkened rooms. He reached the shack and set the basket on the doorstep, adjusted the cloth, stood there a moment longer than he should have, his hand resting on the wicker handle. "I ain't stopping," he said it quiet to the closed door, to the sleeping woman behind it, to the 5 children dreaming inside. Not for the Reverend, not for Ida Brennan, not for any of them. "You hear me, Maggie Dawson? I ain't stopping." The wind carried his words away. Snow began to fall again, soft and starred, covering his boot prints as he walked back to his horse. He mounted up and rode toward home, leaving the basket on the doorstep. Like a promise kept like a line drawn in the snow, like a quiet man's declaration that some things were worth more than the whole world's approval. And in the growing light through a crack in the shutter, she'd opened just enough to see Maggie Dawson watched him go. This time it wasn't dark. This time the dawn had broken enough that she could see him clearly. The broad shoulders, the weathered face, the gray horse, the way he sat in the saddle like a man who'd worked hard all his life and expected to work harder still. Ethan Pierce, the quiet rancher from the third pew, the man who'd asked about Rose's reading, the man who looked at her children like they mattered. She pressed her hand to her heart where his note rested. "You are brave," she whispered to the empty road. "But so are you, Ethan Pierce. So are you." She opened the door and gathered the basket close, carrying it inside to feed her children. But something had changed in the gathering between her ribs, because now she had a face to put with the kindness. Now she knew. Rose appeared in the doorway of the curtained sleeping corner, rubbing her eyes. "Mama is the angel here." Maggie's throat closed. "Go back to sleep, sweet girl. You're crying again." Happy tears. Always happy tears. Rose padded over in bare feet and looked into the basket. Her eyes found the book first, as they always did. This time it was a collection of fables. The spine was cracked, but the pages were clean. She pressed it to her chest. Then she looked at her mother with the two old eyes of a child who understood more than any 10-year-old should. "You know who it is, don't you, Mama?" Maggie wiped her face with the back of her hand. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're crying different today." Not like before. Maggie pulled her oldest daughter close, held her tight, breathed in the smell of her hair, which still somehow smelled like childhood despite everything. "You're too smart for your own good, Rose Dawson." "Is it Mr. Pierce?" Maggie went still. "Why would you say that?" "Because he looks at us in church." Rose pulled back, studying her mother's face. "Like he's counting to make sure we're all there. Like he's checking we're okay. And because the book started coming after he talked to you that Sunday, the day he asked if I was a reader." Maggie stared at her daughter. This girl who'd lost her father at 7, who'd walked across 2 territories with her mother and 4 siblings, who read by lamplight and taught her younger brothers and sisters their letters, who noticed everything and complained about nothing. "Even if it is him," Maggie said carefully, "it don't change anything. We don't take charity, Rose. It ain't charity, Mama." Rose held up the book of fables. "Charity makes you feel small. This don't feel small. This feels like somebody paying attention." Maggie couldn't speak for a moment. Her 10-year-old had just put words to the things she'd been circling for weeks. The baskets never felt like pity, never felt like obligation. They felt like someone had looked at her family and seen what they needed. Not just food, but dignity. Books for Rose, pencils for Lucy, toys for the little ones. The note that said she was brave, someone paying attention. "Get your brothers and sisters up," Maggie said, finally, her voice rough. "We got eggs this morning, real eggs." But even as she spoke, she knew everything had changed. She knew who was bringing the baskets. And tomorrow she would have to decide what to do about it. Sunday morning arrived like Judgment Day. Ethan sat in his usual pew, 3rd row from the front, and tried not to watch the door. He failed. When Maggie walked in with her 5 children, his breath caught the same way it did every week, and every week it surprised him. But today something was different. Maggie didn't go to the back pew. She walked 3 rows further forward than usual and sat her family down in the middle of the church, directly in the sight line of Ida Brennan. Her chin was up. Her back was straight as a fence post. 5 children arranged beside her, scrubbed and neat. She was done hiding in the back. Ethan watched her settle, the children, watched her fold her hands in her lap and fix her eyes straight ahead. She didn't look at him, didn't need to. The act itself was a statement louder than any words. Reverend Hayes delivered his sermon on mercy and judgment. Whether by coincidence or design, Ethan couldn't tell. But he felt the weight of every word. After service, Ethan moved through the congregation with his mind still on Sam's revelation the week before. The boy's innocent observation that angels don't use sandpaper. The moment when everything had been laid bare. She knew. Maggie knew. And now the whole town was starting to piece it together. The rumors would only get worse from here. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Ethan lay in his bed staring at the ceiling while his mind turned over the same question from every angle. She knew. What did that change everything? Nothing. He got up, paced the study, pulled out every drawing, every note, every pressed flower Maggie and her children had left in the basket, spread them across his desk like evidence in a trial. Rose's careful letters, Lucy's purple flowers, Jack's wild horses, Hannah's stick figure family, Sam's wobbly circles, and Maggie's note creased soft from being read 100 times. You have saved us. Agnes Porter found him at his desk at dawn, still dressed, surrounded by children's drawings. You look like a man about to do something either very brave or very stupid, she said from the doorway. Maybe both. Usually is with men. She brought coffee, set it in front of him, looked at the drawings spread across the desk, and said nothing about them. You're going to tell her. I'm going to do more than tell her. Ethan met her eyes. I'm going to ask her to marry me. Agnes Porter didn't gasp or argue or tell him he was a fool. She looked at him steady for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Woke you up, and I think if you don't go, woke you up. And I think if you don't go to her today, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you had. The town will talk. The town's been talking for weeks. They'll talk whether you go or not. Might as well give them something worth talking about. She paused at the door. Wear your good coat. But before Ethan could ride into town, a visitor arrived at the ranch. Warren Caldwell stepped out of his carriage at noon, dressed in his Sunday best despite it being Monday. The banker was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Mr. Pierce, Caldwell extended his hand. I hope I'm not intruding. Ethan shook it, though every instinct told him this wasn't a social call. Mr. Caldwell, what brings you out this way? Business, I'm afraid. Caldwell's smile went sharp at the edges. May we speak inside? They sat in Ethan's study, and Caldwell wasted no time on pleasantries. I'll be direct, Mr. Pierce. I've been hearing concerning rumors about your, shall we say, charitable activities. Ethan's jaw tightened. I don't much care for rumors, Caldwell. Neither do I. But when they involve my business partners, the banker let the words hang in the air. Your loan comes due in 18 months. $8,000. I'd hate for anything to complicate repayment. What's that supposed to mean? A man's reputation affects his creditworthiness. If the town believes you're compromised, I might need additional collateral. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. Of course, all of this could be avoided. My daughter Victoria still holds you in high regard. A proper courtship and engagement would put these rumors to rest immediately. I ain't marrying your daughter, Caldwell. The banker's smile vanished. Then you'd better hope your charity work doesn't cost you everything. He stood adjusting his coat. I'll expect the loan paid in full by the due date, not a day late. Good day, Mr. Pierce. After Caldwell left, Ethan sat in his study for a long time staring at the closed door. The threat was clear. Marry Victoria Caldwell or lose the ranch. Because Caldwell could call in the loan early claim breach of terms, and there wasn't a judge in Montana who wouldn't side with the banker over a rancher accused of impropriety. Dutch appeared in the doorway. I saw Caldwell's carriage. What did he want to own me? He threatened the loan. Ethan nodded. Dutch spat tobacco into the brass spittoon. That's what I figured. Man's been looking for an excuse to get his hooks into this place for years. He paused. What you gonna do? Ethan stood, grabbed his good coat from the hook. I'm going to town. I'm going to knock on Maggie Dawson's door, and I'm going to ask her to marry me. Then I'm going to figure out how to pay off Caldwell before he can take my ranch. Dutch grinned. Now that's the boss I know. Want me to come along? This is something I got to do alone. Ethan rode toward town at midday, no basket this time. Just himself, his good coat, and a heart beating so hard it echoed in his ears. He hitched the mare outside Maggie's shack and stood on the porch for a full minute, fist raised to knock, unable to make his hand move. Inside, he heard the children. Jack's voice low and cheerful. Rose reading aloud. Lucy whispering something to Hannah that made the little girl giggle. Sam making horse sounds running across the floor. And Maggie singing something low and sweet while she worked. A hymn, maybe. The melody came through the thin walls like a lifeline. Ethan knocked. The singing stopped. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Maggie stood there in her faded dress, hair pulled back, hands dusted with flour. 5 children froze behind her in various poses of play and study, all of them staring at the man on their porch. Mr. Pierce? Maggie's voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "Mrs. Dawson, may I come in?" She stepped back. The children scattered to the edges of the room, watching with wide eyes. Sam peeked from behind the curtain. Jack stood protectively near his sisters. Rose watched from the table, her book still open, her gaze sharp and assessing. Ethan removed his hat. The shack felt even smaller with him in it. One room for 6 people. Clean, organized, fiercely maintained, but small. God, so small. "Sit down, please." Maggie gestured to the crate table. "I'll make coffee. We have coffee now." She said the last part with a ghost of a smile. "Somebody's been leaving it on our doorstep." Ethan sat. His hands found each other in his lap and held on. "I reckon you know why I'm here." "I reckon I do." Maggie set a tin cup before him, poured coffee with hands that trembled just slightly. The table between them was the same crate table he'd seen through the slats that first night, when she'd divided scraps among 5 plates. "Sam gave you away. Sam's a smart boy." Maggie sat across from him. "Too smart. But I knew before Sam." She looked at her hands. "I saw you that morning during the storm, when you brought the firewood. I opened the shutter and saw you riding away." Ethan's chest constricted. "How long?" "3 weeks. I've known for 3 weeks, and you didn't say anything." "What would I say?" Maggie's voice went soft. "Thank you. That ain't big enough. Stop. I couldn't. My children were eating again. They were sleeping warm." Her voice cracked. "Hannah stopped asking why we couldn't have supper. Sam stopped crying at night. How do I tell a man to stop when his kindness is the only thing keeping my family alive?" "You don't." Ethan leaned forward. "You never have to. The town thinks I'm a kept woman, Mr. Pierce." "Ethan, the town thinks I'm selling myself for eggs and flour." Maggie's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Hawkins said it to my face. Not in those words, but close enough." Before Ethan could respond, the door banged open without warning. Reverend Hayes stood on the threshold, face tight with authority. Behind him, Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Hawkins and a half-dozen others who'd apparently followed Ethan's horse to the shack. The crowd pressed close, necks, craning faces split between curiosity and judgment. "Mr. Pierce." The Reverend stepped inside without invitation. "I heard you'd come here. I think this has gone far enough." Ethan set his coffee cup down carefully and stood to his full height. In the small room, he towered over the Reverend by half a head. "You're right, Reverend. It has gone far enough." He turned to Maggie and extended his hand. She took it and rose beside him. "Mrs. Dawson has agreed to become my wife." The crowd erupted. Gasps, whispers. Ida Brennan's sharp intake of breath. "Now, Mr. Pierce, let's be reasonable." The Reverend raised his hands. "This is exactly the kind of hasty decision that creates scandal. A man of your position, a woman of her circumstances." "Her circumstances." Ethan's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You mean her poverty?" "Just say it plain, Reverend. You mean she's poor and I'm rich, and that makes this improper?" "I mean, there are appearances to consider. I have considered them." Ethan's voice dropped lower, steadier. "I considered them every morning at 4 when I rode through blizzards to make sure her children had breakfast." "Where were you at 4 in the morning, Reverend?" "Where were any of you?" He looked past Hayes to the crowd, met their eyes one by one. Ida Brennan, Mrs. Hawkins, old Peterson, the ranch hands, the shopkeepers, the church ladies who'd offered Maggie 1 basket at Christmas and a year of whispers. "This woman has been hungry in your town for months. Her children ate scraps while you all sat at full tables. Not one of you knocked on her door to ask if she needed help. Not one of you invited her children for a meal. You let her starve in silence. And then when someone finally helped, you turned it into a scandal." The crowd shifted. Some faces flushed. Others looked at the floor. "I ain't asking your permission." Ethan's voice carried to every corner of the small room and out the open door. "I'm telling you what's happening. I love this woman. I love her children. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure they never go hungry again. If that offends your sensibilities, take it up with the God you preach about on Sundays. The one who said to feed the hungry and shelter the poor. The one none of you seem to remember Monday through Saturday." Silence fell heavy and absolute. Then old Peterson, standing at the back of the crowd, took off his hat. "I think it's a fine thing, Mr. Pierce. Takes a man of real character to do what you done." A murmur moved through the crowd, softer, now thoughtful. Mrs. Brennan stepped forward. Her face had changed, the sharpness gone replaced by something raw and ashamed. I owe you both an apology. What I said, the things I spread. She looked at Maggie. I'm sorry, Mrs. Dawson. You deserve better from me, from all of us. One by one, faces softened. Not all of them. Some stayed hard, arms crossed, lips thin. But enough. Enough for the balance to shift, for the tide to turn, for the weight of judgment to ease just enough to breathe. Reverend Hayes stood quiet through it all. When the murmuring faded, he cleared his throat, looked at Ethan, looked at Maggie, looked at 5 children pressed close to their mother, watching the adults with eyes that had already seen too much. Perhaps, he said slowly, I have been too concerned with propriety and not enough with mercy. He removed his hat. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to perform the ceremony. Maggie's hand tightened in Ethan's. Her voice came clear and strong, carrying across the room and out the door to every ear in the crowd. We'd be grateful, Reverend. They married on a Thursday. No fuss, no grand ceremony. Just Reverend Hayes in the small church with Agnes Porter and Dutch Morrison as witnesses. The pews sat empty except for a handful of townspeople who'd come out of genuine goodwill rather than curiosity. Maggie wore a dress that Ida Brennan had altered to fit. The same woman who'd spread poison now stitched kindness into every seam. She'd brought it to Maggie's door 2 days after the proposal, eyes red, hands shaking. I ain't much with apologies, Mrs. Dawson, but I'm fair handy with a needle. Please let me do this. Maggie had taken the dress, not because she'd forgiven Ida Brennan entirely, but because she understood that people change the same way seasons did. Slow, uneven, but real when it happened. The dress was simple. Blue calico with white lace at the collar. Nothing fancy but clean and new in hers. Rose had helped her pin up her hair that morning, weaving in wildflowers Lucy had picked from the creek bank. Ethan stood at the altar in his good coat, the one Agnes had pressed 3 times because his hands kept creasing it while he paced. His hair was combed, his boots were polished. His face carried the expression of a man who couldn't quite believe what was happening to him. The children sat in the front pew. Rose held Sam on her lap. Lucy clutched her drawing pencil, already sketching the scene on a scrap of paper. Jack sat straight, trying to look serious, failing, because Hannah kept poking his ribs and whispering questions about whether they'd get cake. Do you, Ethan James Pierce, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife? I do. No hesitation, not a flicker of doubt. And do you, Margaret Marie Dawson, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband? Maggie looked at Ethan. At this man who'd ridden through blizzards before dawn to leave food on her doorstep, who'd carved wooden horses at midnight, who'd tucked books into baskets because he'd noticed her daughter trying to read from 3 pews back, who'd stood in front of the whole town and chosen her over his reputation without blinking. I do. Her voice didn't waver. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. Ethan kissed her, gentle and careful, like she was something precious he'd been trusted to hold. Maggie's hand came up to his cheek, rough palm against rough jaw, and she kissed him back with the quiet fierceness of a woman who'd stopped believing good things could happen and just had one happen anyway. Papa Ethan Sam's voice rang through the church. Can thunder come to the ranch now? Laughter broke the solemnity. Real laughter, the kind that filled a room and made it holy. They rode to the ranch in Ethan's wagon, all 7 of them crowded together. The children bounced with excitement, pointing at everything they passed. Jack peppered Ethan with questions about the horses. Rose sat quiet, clutching her books. Lucy drew the landscape as it rolled by. Hannah sang a made-up song about their new house. Sam fell asleep against Maggie's shoulder, thunder still gripped in his fist. Maggie watched the land unfold around them. 300 acres of rolling Montana territory, fences that stretched to the horizon, cattle grazing in winter pastures, and in the distance the house. Bigger than any place she'd ever lived, with smoke rising from the chimney and light glowing in the windows. Agnes had prepared everything. Fires in every hearth, beds made with clean linens, a wedding supper laid out on the dining room table. The children spilled out of the wagon like water breaking through a dam. They ran toward the house, then stopped at the porch steps, suddenly uncertain. It's your home now, Ethan said quietly. You don't have to ask permission. Rose took the first step, then Lucy, then the others, moving slowly like they might break something if they weren't careful. Inside, they stood in the front hall and stared, at the wooden floors without gaps, at the walls that didn't let in wind, At the room, so many rooms stretching away in every direction. Agnes appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Welcome home, Mrs. Pierce." Maggie couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears spilling over, despite her best efforts to hold them back. "Let me show you to your rooms," Agnes said, directing her words to the children. "You'll each have your own." Our own Jack's voice came out as a squeak. "Your own." The children followed Agnes up the stairs like they were climbing into a dream. Maggie and Ethan stood alone in the hall, listening to the exclamations of wonder drifting down from above. "Thank you," Maggie whispered. Ethan pulled her close, rested his chin on top of her head. "For what? For seeing us. For all of it. You saved me too, Maggie. Don't forget that." That night, after the children were asleep in beds with real mattresses and warm blankets, Maggie couldn't sleep. She walked barefoot down the hall, checking each room. Rose and Lucy shared the first bedroom. Rose slept with a book on her pillow, the fables Ethan had sent in the basket. Lucy's drawings were already tacked to the wall, purple flowers and stick figure families and a horse that might have been thunder. Jack had his own room for the first time in his life. He'd arranged both wooden horses on the nightstand like sentries. His coat, the one with the patched elbow, hung on a hook by the door. He'd put it there himself, careful like the room might disappear if he didn't treat it right. Hannah and Sam shared the last bedroom. Hannah slept spread across the entire bed, arms flung wide, the rag doll tucked under her chin. Sam had rolled to the floor at some point, curled up on the rug with thunder clutched to his chest, sleeping sounder than Maggie had ever seen him sleep. She knelt beside him, adjusted the blanket, touched his hair. "You ain't hungry tonight, baby," she whispered. "And you won't be hungry tomorrow. Not ever again." She didn't hear Ethan come up behind her, didn't know he was there until his hands settled on her shoulder, warm and steady. "They okay, they're perfect." Maggie stood, turned to face him in the dim hallway. His eyes caught the moonlight from the window. "Ethan, I need you to understand something." "What's that?" "I didn't marry you because of this house or the food or the warm beds." "I know that, Maggie. Let me finish." She pressed her hand flat against his chest over his heart. "I married you because of a wooden horse and a book of fables and a note that said, 'I was brave.' I married you because you saw my children as people, not problems. Because you noticed Rose wanted to read and Lucy needed pencils, and Jack dreamed about horses, and Hannah loved dolls, and Sam just needed something to hold on to." Her voice caught. "Thomas was a good man. He loved us. But he's gone, and I spent 2 years trying to be enough for 5 children on my own, trying to be mother and father and provider and protector. And I was failing Ethan. Every single day I was failing. You weren't failing. I was feeding them garbage. You were keeping them alive. There's a difference between failing and being failed by every person around you." Ethan covered her hand with his. "This town failed you, Maggie, not the other way around." She leaned her forehead against his chest, felt his heartbeat strong and steady. "How did you know what, that we needed you, that night when you stopped your horse and looked through the wall? How did you know?" Ethan was quiet a long time. His hand moved to her hair, smoothing it gentle. "Because I recognized it. The smile, the way you made nothing look like something for your children's sake. My mother used to do the same thing. Same smile, same steady hands, dividing scraps. I was that boy, Maggie, the one sitting at the table believing his mama when she said there was plenty. The flower on your porch, the flower on our porch." His voice thickened. "Somebody saved us. I never knew who. Never got to say thank you. Spent my whole life building this ranch telling myself it was enough. Telling myself success meant something. But it didn't. Not until I saw you on that floor, being the bravest person I'd ever witnessed, and realized I'd been given all this abundance for a reason. To leave baskets on a stranger's doorstep. To find my family." They stood in the hallway between their sleeping children and let the silence hold them. But even as they settled into their new life, Warren Caldwell was not finished. 3 days after the wedding, Ethan rode into town to settle accounts at the bank. He found Caldwell waiting in his office, smile sharp as a knife. "Mr. Pierce, or should I say Mr. Dawson now?" The banker's voice dripped with false courtesy. "I heard about your hasty marriage. Congratulations. What do you want, Caldwell?" "Just to remind you of our previous conversation. Your loan comes due in 18 months, $8,000. The banker leaned back in his chair. "Of course, given recent events, I've been reconsidering the terms. What terms? The contract's clear. Contracts can be renegotiated, especially when a borrower's behavior suggests instability. Marrying a mail-order bride with 5 children after a scandal, well, it raises questions about judgment. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. There's no scandal. We're legally married. But the appearance, Mr. Pierce, Caldwell spread his hands. The bank board might view this as a liability, unless, of course, you could provide additional collateral. Say another 100 acres of your eastern pasture. The eastern pasture was Ethan's best grazing land. Giving it up would cripple the ranch. You want my land. I want assurance that my investment is secure. Caldwell's smile never wavered. You have 1 week to decide. Provide the collateral, or I'll be forced to call in the loan early. You can't do that. Read your contract, Mr. Pierce. Section 12, subsection 3. Moral turpitude clause. The bank reserves the right to recall the loan if the borrower engages in behavior deemed detrimental to the bank's reputation. There's no moral turpitude. I married a woman of questionable background in a manner that created public scandal. Caldwell stood. 1 week, Mr. Pierce. Good day. Ethan rode home in a fury that threatened to choke him. He'd escaped scandal only to walk into a trap of Caldwell's making. That evening, he sat in his study poring over the loan documents. Dutch found him there at midnight, surrounded by papers. Boss, you're going to burn your eyes out. Caldwell's calling in the loan. Dutch whistled low. On what grounds moral turpitude clause? Says I damaged the bank's reputation by marrying Maggie. That's horse shit. That's legal. Ethan threw the papers down. He's got me Dutch. Either I give him 100 acres of prime grazing land, or I pay $8,000 in 1 week. I don't have $8,000 in cash. What about selling cattle? Not enough time. And even if I could, I'd be selling at winter prices. I'd take a bath. Dutch was quiet for a moment. What about the town? Some of them owe you favors, not $8,000 worth. They sat in silence, the impossibility of the situation settling around them like snow. Then Maggie appeared in the doorway. How much did you need? Ethan looked up, surprised. She wore her nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair hung loose down her back. Maggie, this ain't your concern. How much? $8,000. By next Wednesday. She walked to the desk and picked up the loan documents, reading them carefully despite the difficulty. Her lips moved as she worked through the legal language. This clause here, she pointed. It says moral turpitude, but it don't define what that means. So Caldwell has to prove you did something immoral. Marrying me ain't immoral. It's legal, sanctioned by the church. Ethan stared at her. You're right. Of course I'm right. Maggie set the papers down. You need a lawyer to argue this, someone who can stand up to Caldwell in court if necessary. I don't have money for a lawyer, but I know someone who might help. Maggie's expression turned thoughtful. Mrs. Brennan's husband used to practice law before he opened the mercantile, and I think Ida owes us a favor. The next morning, Maggie walked into Brennan's mercantile with her head high and her purpose clear. Ida stood behind the counter, and her face went pale when she saw Maggie approaching. Mrs. Pierce, I didn't expect to see you. Mrs. Brennan, Maggie kept her voice level. I need to speak with your husband about a legal matter. Edgar's in the back, Ida hesitated. Is everything all right, Warren? Caldwell is trying to steal my husband's ranch. Within the hour, Edgar Brennan sat in Ethan's study reviewing the loan documents with the eye of a man who hadn't forgotten his legal training. This is weak, he said finally. Very weak. Moral turpitude requires proof of actual immoral conduct. Marriage doesn't qualify, even scandalous marriage. Can you argue that in court I can do better? Edgar looked up with a gleam in his eye. I can file an injunction blocking Caldwell from calling the loan early. Force him to wait for the original due date. That gives you 18 months to pay instead of 1 week. What's that cost? Edgar glanced at Maggie, then back at Ethan. Consider it repayment for my wife's unkindness. No charge. 3 days later, Edgar Brennan walked into the bank and served Warren Caldwell with legal papers. The banker's face turned purple as he read, This is outrageous. This is the law, Mr. Caldwell. Edgar's voice was calm and professional. You cannot arbitrarily declare moral turpitude without evidence. My client has committed no crime and violated no legitimate clause of your contract. I'll fight this. Please do. Edgar smiled. I look forward to explaining to a judge why you're harassing a man for the crime of marrying a widow and providing for her children. I'm sure that will reflect well on the bank's reputation. Caldwell slammed the papers on his desk. Get out. Edgar tipped his hat. Good day, Mr. Caldwell. We'll see you in court if necessary. Otherwise, the loan stands as written. Due in 18 months, not one day sooner. That evening, Ethan found Edgar at the mercantile and shook his hand for a full minute without saying a word. Thank you, don't cover it. Then don't say it. Edgar smiled. Just be good to that wife of yours. She's the one who thought of coming to me. I will. Ethan meant it with every fiber of his being. The weeks that followed reshaped the ranch in ways Ethan hadn't imagined. His house, which had been a monument to success and nothing else, became something living, something loud and chaotic and wonderful. Jack discovered the horses on the second day. Ethan found him in the barn at dawn, standing on a bucket trying to pet the big bay gelding that was 3 times his size. Son, that horse could flatten you with one hoof. He likes me. Jack's face shone with certainty. He told me, horses don't talk. This one does. He said his name is Duke and he wants an apple. Ethan looked at the gelding. The gelding looked back with an expression of mild tolerance. His name is actually Buckshot. He likes Duke better. Ethan taught him to ride that afternoon. Put him up on the gentlest mare in the string, a fat little paint named Biscuit, who moved like she was wading through honey. Jack took to it like he'd been born in a saddle. Within a week, he was trotting. Within 2, he was helping Dutch move cattle from the lower pasture. That boy's a natural, Dutch told Ethan one evening, watching Jack ride across the field with the easy seat of a born horseman. Better than most ranch hands I've hired. Don't tell him that. His head's big enough already. Too late. I already told him twice. Rose found the study. Ethan came home from fencing one afternoon to find her curled in his leather chair, surrounded by every book he owned, reading with the focused intensities of someone making up for lost time. I hope you don't mind, Maggie said from the doorway, looking worried. She found the shelves and I couldn't pull her away. Mind, Ethan looked at his study, which had been a tomb of ledger books, in silence for 10 years now, occupied by a 10-year-old girl with ink on her fingers and wonder in her eyes. This is the first time this room's had been used for anything that matters. He bought more books, ordered them from catalogs, crates of them, everything from primers to poetry to history to adventure stories. When they arrived, Rose sat on the floor and opened each one with reverent hands, like they were Christmas presents made of gold. Papa Ethan. She looked up at him with shining eyes. There's a whole book just about birds. There's a whole world in that room, Rose. It's all yours. Lucy transformed the kitchen wall. Maggie found her there one morning drawing directly on the plaster with her pencils. A mural was taking shape. Flowers and mountains and horses and a house with smoke curling from the chimney. 7 stick figures in front of it holding hands. Lucy Marie Dawson. Maggie's voice held the practiced shock of a mother who'd seen worse. You're drawing on the wall, Papa. Ethan said I could. Maggie turned to Ethan, who was suddenly very interested in his coffee cup. You told her she could draw on our wall. I told her she could draw anywhere she wanted. He met Maggie's eyes over the rim. It's just plaster, Maggie, but that's art. Maggie looked at the mural, at her quiet daughter's face glowing with a joy Lucy rarely showed, at the 7 figures holding hands, the tallest one now clearly wearing a hat. Use the good pencils, Maggie said finally, and stay below the window line. Lucy smiled. It was the widest smile Maggie had seen from her in 2 years. Hannah appointed herself official ranch greeter. Any visitor, whether Dutch or the feed delivery man or neighbors checking fence lines, received a formal welcome that involved a curtsy, a recitation of her name and age, and an introduction to her ragdoll whose name was Rosie and who was, according to Hannah, the most beautiful lady in Montana Territory. She gets that from you, Ethan told Maggie. The curtsying or the talking, the certainty that she belongs exactly where she is. Sam followed Ethan everywhere. Every morning the boy appeared at his side like a shadow wooden horse, in one hand the other hand reaching up for Ethan's. They walked the ranch together, checked fences, fed chickens, stood in the barn while Ethan worked Sam, providing a running commentary that consisted mostly of what Thunder thought about various situations. Thunder says that cow looks sad. That cow always looks like that. Thunder says you should give her extra hay. Thunder's got strong opinions for a piece of wood. Sam considered this. Thunder says you're his favorite person. After Mama. Ethan had to turn away, pretend to adjust a harness blink until his eyes cleared. Agnes Porter watched it all unfold with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd been right and knew it. She taught Maggie the kitchen, not as a servant, but as a partner. They cooked together, cleaned together, ran the household as a team. You don't have to scrub the floors yourself, Mrs. Pierce, Agnes said one morning, finding Maggie on her knees with a brush. I know I don't have to. I want to. Maggie sat back on her heels. This is my home, Agnes. First real home I've had since Thomas died. I want to take care of it with my own hands. Agnes nodded and understood something in that statement that went deeper than housework. Well, then I'll start on the windows. We'll meet in the middle. The town shifted not overnight, not all at once, but the way ice broke in spring. Gradual and then sudden and then complete. People nodded when the Pierce family passed on the street. Church ladies brought preserves and baking advice. Children from town came to play running wild across the ranch land in packs that included the Dawson children and everyone else's without distinction. Ida Brennan brought Maggie a pie one Tuesday afternoon, stood on the porch with it in both hands, face working through emotions too complicated for words. Apple, she said, my mother's recipe. Maggie took the pie. Thank you, Ida. I've been meaning to say. Ida started again. What I did, the talking, the gossip, I'm ashamed of it. You were struggling, and instead of helping, I made it worse. I made it ugly. You did. Ida flinched, but Maggie continued. And now you're here with it, and that matters too. Does it? My husband used to say people ain't what they do at their worst. They're what they do after. Maggie held the door open. You want to come in? Rose is reading aloud, and the children would love an audience. Ida Brennan stepped into the Pierce house and didn't leave for 2 hours. She came back the following Tuesday with another P and the Tuesday after that. It became a thing between them. Not quite friendship yet, but something growing in that direction. Something that proved people could choose to be better when someone gave them room to try. Spring arrived slow but certain. The snow pulled back from the fields like a tide going out. Green showed beneath brown. The creek began to move again, ice cracking into pieces that tumbled downstream. Ethan planted fence posts while Jack handed him nails. Maggie started a garden outside the kitchen window, pressing seeds into earth that would yield vegetables and herbs and the flowers Lucy wanted to draw from life instead of memory. One evening in late April, after the children were asleep, Ethan and Maggie sat on the porch bench he'd built for her. The air smelled like wet earth and new grass. Stars scattered across the sky like someone had thrown a handful of diamonds. I need to tell you something, Maggie said. Something I should have told you weeks ago. Ethan waited. That morning during the storm, when I opened the shutter and saw you riding away, she pulled her shawl tighter. That wasn't the first time I saw you. What do you mean the very first morning? The first basket. I heard your horse. I went to the window and I saw you through the crack setting the basket down in the dark. She turned to face him. I knew it was you from the beginning, Ethan. From the very first day. He stared at her. All this time from the very beginning, what was I supposed to do? Maggie's voice went soft. A stranger was saving my family. And then I realized it wasn't a stranger. It was the quiet man from the third pew who looked at my children like they mattered. Was I supposed to march up to you and ruin the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for us? I was sneaking around like a thief. You were being kind. The purest kind of kind. The kind that don't need credit. She took his hand. I prayed every night that you'd find the courage to come forward. Not because I needed to thank you, but because I wanted to know you. The man behind the baskets. And when I knocked on your door with the whole town watching, that's when I knew. Knew what? That I loved you. Maggie's voice trembled. Not the baskets, not the gifts. That moment when you chose me over everything else. Over your reputation, your standing, your comfort. You stood on my porch and knocked, and the whole world was watching, and you didn't care. I was scared half to death, so was I. She leaned into him. But you knocked anyway. That's what love looks like, Ethan. Not grand gestures, not speeches. Just a man knocking on a door when it would be easier not to. From inside the house, a small voice drifted through the open window. Sam talking in his sleep. Thunder says goodnight, Papa Ethan. Ethan laughed. The sound surprised him, full and warm and real. The laugh of a man who'd forgotten what joy sounded like and just remembered. You know what Rose asked me today, Maggie said. What? She asked if she could call you Papa. Not Papa Ethan, just Papa. His breath caught. What did you tell her I told her to ask you herself? And she said she would tomorrow at breakfast. She's been practicing how to say it. Lucy's going to ask too. And Jack, though he'll probably punch your arm instead because that's how Jack shows affection. Maggie smiled. And Hannah. Hannah's been calling you Papa since the second day. You just haven't noticed because she says it under her breath while she's curtsying. Ethan pressed his face into Maggie's hair. His shoulders shook. She held him steady and sure while a man who'd built an empire discovered that the only thing he'd ever wanted was this. A porch, a woman's warmth, children sleeping safe behind him, the sound of his name spoken by small voices who'd chosen him the same way he'd chosen them. I spent 10 years building this ranch, he said, voice rough. Thought it meant something. Thought the land and the cattle and the house proved I was worth something. You are worth something. Not because of any of that. He lifted his head, looked at the house behind them. Windows glowing warm, filled with noise and life in the beautiful mess of family. Because of this. Because of you and those 5 children. And this ridiculous wooden horse that runs this household. Maggie laughed. The sound carried across the ranch, across the fields, where snow had finally surrendered to spring, across the creek where water ran free again. You know what Thomas would have said about all this? Tell me. He would have said, Maggie, you went and found the only man in Montana Territory stubborn enough to match you. She smiled. And then he would have shaken your hand and thanked you for keeping his family safe. I wish I could have met him. You'd have liked each other. Both quiet, both stubborn, both terrible at saying what you feel and good at showing it. They sat in silence for a while. Stars burned bright above the ranch, their ranch, filled with light and laughter and the breathing of 5 children who'd gone from hunger to home in the space of a single winter. Ethan, yeah, thank you. For the baskets, for the books and the haze and the pencils and the doll, for the firewood and the blizzard, for the note that said I was brave, her voice trembled, for knocking on my door. He kissed the top of her head. Thank you for opening it. Inside the house, a lamp glowed warm in the kitchen window. Maggie had put it there their first night. Said she wanted anyone passing in the dark to see that light and know someone was home. Know someone was warm and safe and loved inside those walls. Ethan thought about the nameless stranger who'd left a sack of flour on a porch decades ago. About his mother's letter, never sent still, pressed in his Bible. You saved my son's life. About the chain of mercy that stretched from that unknown act of kindness to this moment. This porch, this woman, these children, this life he never knew he was building toward. Sometimes grace came in baskets left on doorsteps before dawn. Sometimes it came in second chances nobody deserved but everybody needed. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to knock on a door when the whole world told you not to, it came in the form of a family you didn't know you were searching for. A woman who turned scraps into feasts. 5 children who turned silence into laughter. A wooden horse named Thunder, who, according to Sam, approved of everything. Maggie's hand found Ethan's in the dark. Her fingers laced through his rough and thin and strong. The lamp burned steady in the window. The stars held their positions overhead. And on the porch of a ranch that was no longer empty, 2 people who'd found each other through kindness and courage, and the stubborn refusal to let fear win, sat together watching spring take hold of the land. Not because the world had been kind to them, but because they'd been kind to each other. And that in the end was the only thing that mattered. The only thing that lasted. The only thing strong enough to build a home on. The light in the window burned on. And it did not go out.